Story is that Boris Johnson will today urge world leaders to preserve our planet for generations to come.
He will tell a virtual summit hosted by US President Joe Biden that 2021 must be the year countries get serious about stopping climate change. Our chief environment correspondent Justin Rowlatt reports.
John Kerry, President Biden's climate envoy, has been elbow bumping his way around the world in the past few weeks as part of the US's effort to raise global ambition on the climate issue.
We'll work together to address the climate crisis.
This week, the UK announced it planned to make even more aggressive emissions cuts and to kickstart the talks, we're anticipating the US president will do the same. Mr. Biden is expected to say the US will make a 50% cut in emissions by the end of the decade and go to net zero by 2050. That means cutting emissions as much as possible and capturing those that can't be prevented by planting trees or through engineering solutions. The UK says the world is moving on the climate issue.
When we were announced as the COP26 president, less than 30% of the world economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at 70%. So we have seen some progress, but what we need to do is to get more progress in terms of near-term emission reduction targets to 2030.
But as Greta Thunberg says, setting targets is easy, delivering on them is much harder.
Of course, it's a step in the right direction, but if only it was that simple that we could just invest and put money in things and that would solve the problem. Of course, that will be required as well, but it would take so much more than that. We need to be realistic and see the whole picture.
The idea of the meeting today, which is being hosted virtually from Washington, is to get big emitting nations to raise their game on climate. What is needed at Glasgow in November is to get them to commit to policies that really will deliver carbon cuts that can keep climate change within manageable limits. Justin Rowlatt, BBC News.
The world's largest ever report into climate change is going to be published later this morning, setting out the stark reality of the state of the planet and the need to cut emissions.
The landmark study by a group of UN researchers will be the most up-to-date assessment of the impact of global warming.
It is unequivocal that human activities are responsible for climate change. That's the finding of a new study by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the most up-to-date assessment of how global warming will change the world in the coming decades. Environmental experts have called it a massive wake-up call to governments to cut emissions. 234 authors from 66 countries have worked on the landmark assessment. The report says global average temperature rise could reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next 20 years. Now that is 10 years sooner than expected. That temperature rise will breach the ambition of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement and bring widespread devastation and unprecedented extreme weather. This all comes less than 3 months before the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow in Scotland. Vital UN talks that will determine the future course of efforts to tackle climate change. And the UK minister responsible for delivering COP26 has released this statement following the publication of today's report. He says, "Our message to every country, government, business and part of society is simple. The next decade is decisive. Follow the science and embrace your responsibility to keep the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius alive." Our environment and energy analyst Roger Harabin has more.
Wildfires blazing through Greece and Turkey have horrified people in the region. The panel concludes we'll see a lot more fires as temperatures continue to rise. And rise they will as greenhouse gas emissions keep growing and growing. The increased heat will change weather patterns, bringing more droughts and more rainfall, researchers say. London was shocked to find areas underwater a few weeks ago. Rainfall patterns are hard to predict, but experts say Northern Europe will be wetter overall. At London's Hampstead Ponds, they've already had to raise and reinforce the dams to protect hundreds of homes downstream from the sort of floods expected in extreme rains that are forecast to come. The cost has been huge. We're already paying the price of ignoring scientists' warnings on climate change.
So this report states as an absolute fact that human influence is warming the climate. And that's a very stark reminder that it is our activities which are changing the climate and affecting these extreme weather events. And as the planet continues to warm, these consequences just get worse.
Ice in the Arctic is melting faster than many scientists predicted. That leads to sea level rise, which in turn increases coastal flooding. The seas will keep rising for maybe thousands of years because the ocean deep has absorbed so much heat already. Political attitudes are changing. The UK is getting electric cars. We need clean technology for home heating too. In the words of one leading scientist, we're not doomed, but if we want to avoid catastrophe, we have to drastically cut emissions. Now. Roger Harrabin, BBC News.
Valerie Masson-Delmotte is a climate scientist and co-chair of one of the IPCC working groups which produced the climate change report. She said the threshold of keeping the global temperature at 1.5 degrees Celsius limit will be breached around 2050.
The report shows that in the next 20 years, global warming, the average temperature at the Earth's surface over a period of 20 years, is expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above the late 1800s. However, if we rapidly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if we can reach global net zero CO2 emissions around 2050, it is extremely likely that we can keep global warming well below 2 degrees. If we do this, it is more likely than not that temperature would gradually decline to below or around 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, with a temporary overshoot of no more than 0.1 degrees Celsius. But if global greenhouse gas emissions remain around today's levels in the coming decades, we would reach 2 degrees of global warming by the middle of this century.
We're joined now by Tamsin Edwards, a climate scientist and one of the authors of this report. Welcome to BBC News. I know your area of expertise is the oceans and sea level change, and in fact you spent 3 years investigating this, haven't you? So it would be remiss of me not to find out more about that. What did you find exactly?
Well, that's right. We have over 200 authors in the whole report. We have looked at 14,000 scientific studies over 3 years. And I work on ice sheets and sea level rise. As you say, we don't do new research. We assess the robustness of the evidence. So, for example, for the Antarctic ice sheet, we looked at the range of possibilities of the future of the ice sheet and therefore its contribution to sea level rise.
And one of your findings is that the melting of Greenland glaciers is irreversible. Am I right?
Well, that's right. So there are different parts of, there are different ice regions around the world. We have the glaciers of the mountains and the polar regions, and we have the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. The mountain and polar glaciers are particularly sensitive, and we have already committed to further melting over the next decades to hundreds of years. We're also going to see more ice loss from the Greenland ice sheet over the next century, over this century. And for the Antarctic ice sheet, there's a really wide range of possibilities. If we limit greenhouse gas emissions, we may be fortunate and have a relatively low contribution to sea level rise. But if we have very high greenhouse gas emissions and we're unlucky with how sensitive that ice sheet is, we could see very high sea level rise indeed.
So am I right that the message is there's no going back from some change? Once they've melted, they can't be refrozen, I assume. But there is a cautious optimism that this could be slowed or indeed even halted, or is that putting it too optimistically?
We think that the mountain and polar the mountain and polar glaciers, the smaller glaciers and also Arctic sea ice could have some reversible changes. So if we limit warming and eventually reduce temperatures further, that those could regrow and restore to some degree. The ice sheets are much slower to respond. So Greenland and Antarctica will keep responding for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And combined with the warming of the ocean, which makes it expand and contribute to sea level rise, that means sea levels are going to remain elevated for thousands of years.
I was very struck by what Inga Anderson said, the Executive Director of the UN Environment Programme. She said, scientists have been telling us for over 3 decades of the dangers of allowing the planet to warm. The world listened but did not hear. And I wondered, do you think government and people will... It's a difference, isn't it, between taking any notice of this and doing something about it?
Of course. I mean, speaking personally, I do sense a real shift in the conversation over the last few years. But I think what this IPCC assessment report shows, it's much more comprehensive than ever before, assessed more of the scientific evidence than ever before. Obviously, the timing with respect to the COP26 meeting later this year, it really shows that if we do have immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we can still limit warming to 1.5 degrees above the sort of late 1800s, as we've heard, without much overshoot and eventually go to lower warming again. But if we don't enact the policies and pledges that we already have in place, and in fact, if we don't make those stronger, then we won't meet that target.
But what are your conclusions about reducing those greenhouse gas emissions and keeping temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels? Can it be done?
Well, this particular part of the IPCC report is called the Working Group 1 report, which is around the science of climate change. And so we looked at different scenarios of emissions and what that would mean for climate change. What we need to look out for next year is the third working group, which looks at mitigation. In other words, where are those emissions coming from? What are the different pathways to cutting those emissions? So that will give much more of that detail about exactly the how of cutting emissions. Whereas what this report is doing is showing the implications of very low emissions or medium, intermediate emissions or very high, what that actually implies for the extreme weather, for the sea level rise and other changes in climate.
No, I understand. That's really useful. Tamsin Edwards, climate scientist at King's College London and one of the authors of the report. Thanks so much for your time.
Well, the UK government has already set ambitious climate change targets. So will this report affect those? Let's speak to our chief political correspondent, Adam Fleming. And we understand this really is going to be a stark warning for everyone. Adam, morning to you.
Morning, Lou. Yeah, this is all part of the big build-up to this huge climate change conference that the UK is going to host in Glasgow in November, where every country in the world will be expected to make commitments for how it will reduce its carbon emissions over the next few years so that the planet gets only 2 degrees hotter, or in an ideal world, only a maximum of 1.5 degrees hotter. And not enough pledges have been made to hit those targets yet. So this is a warning about what will happen and what the risk could be if that climate change conference doesn't work. Also, there will be a huge risk to the UK's reputation if they preside over an event that doesn't reach its objectives. But before we even get to Glasgow, there's still quite a lot of stuff we're waiting for the government. We think that later this month we'll get a strategy about hydrogen, using hydrogen to replace gas in the UK's energy mix because it's a cleaner fuel. Very much delayed is a document from the Treasury, which is just looking at the overall costs to the economy and individuals and the government about how to get here. And this is big controversial stuff. And here's an example. Fuel duty, the government raises £28 billion a year from the tax on petrol and diesel. When petrol and diesel cars start disappearing from 2030 onwards, how will they raise that huge sum of money? And how will that change the taxes you and I pay for? So everyone can be very concerned about the data from the scientists, but then once it gets down to policy decisions, it can get much, much trickier.
Yeah, these are really knotty issues. Thank you very much, Adam. We'll speak to you later. Thank you.
Well, meanwhile, wildfires are continuing to rip through the Greek island of Evia as the country experiences its worst heatwave in 30 years.
Thousands of residents and tourists have been evacuated from the region, with the blazes showing no signs of subsiding. Our reporter Matt Graveling has the latest.
Thousands of hectares, habitats, homes, all reduced to ash. With each change in the wind carving a new path of devastation, those who stay save whatever they can. Others pack up their lives and head to the port.
It's like a scene of an apocalyptic movie, definitely, because there is no sky, the sun is red. It's quite scary.
More than 2,000 people have been evacuated from Evia by ferry. Once off the island, miles of smoke show the scale of the fight. And it's this smoke authorities say hampers efforts to douse fires from above. Those on the ground say more needs to be done.
The most people see that we don't have any help until yesterday, and they could save everybody, and it wasn't true. The people don't know where to go. The big problem is that we feel that they let us burn.
France, Germany and the UK have all offered their help to Greece, currently experiencing its hottest weather for 30 years. Scientists warn that failure to tackle our impact on climate change means temperatures and the consequences will continue to rise. Matt Graveling, BBC News.
We're going to be joined a bit later from Greece by people, British holidaymakers, who are waiting to find out what those fires mean for them.
COVID-19 has changed the way we live. Lockdowns mean people around the world have taken fewer car journeys, flights have been grounded, and industry has shut down. And you can see the difference that's made to air quality in some of the most polluted cities. But what about something you can't see? Carbon dioxide, one of the key greenhouse gases responsible for climate change. As the pandemic spread around the globe, CO2 emissions did fall as countries went into lockdowns. The falls in emissions have been bigger than in any past economic slowdown, including during the Second World War. This may sound like good news for our climate, but it's not that simple. Think of carbon emissions like the taps filling a bathtub. This year, those taps have been turned down. The water, or the CO2, is flowing a bit more slowly. But the bath is still filling up. In fact, on the 1st of June 2020, while many countries were in lockdowns, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere reached its highest level in human history, and quite possibly the highest in 3 million years. So, our carbon bathtub is pretty full, and we can't just simply pull out the plug. Carbon dioxide is absorbed by the plants and the oceans, like natural sponges. But this takes time. CO2 emitted today will still be in the atmosphere in hundreds of years. So, there'd need to be a long-term drop in carbon dioxide output to make a real difference to the climate crisis. And the question is, what will the recovery from the pandemic look like? We've already seen that as countries' economies open up again, emissions also return to their upward trend. For them to continue slowing down, some of the changes the pandemic's forced us to make to work, industry and travel would have to become more permanent. Even while the world's attention has been focused on coronavirus, the effects of climate change have continued. 2020 is set to end up as one of the warmest years on record. In the fight to tackle the climate crisis, it'll be up to governments and societies to decide whether the drop in CO2 emissions caused by the pandemic is the new normal or just a drop in the ocean.
This is not just a forest burning, this is almost a cemetery because all you can see is dead.
The biggest problem now facing the world is climate change. Greenland has impacts all around the planet. 1 billion tons of ice lost here raises sea levels all over the world. If we don't figure out how to do something about this, and pretty quickly, we're going to hit a catastrophic tipping point.
It is just terrifying, really, how absolutely endless the line of fire is.
climate crisis is the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and yet it has been ignored for decades.
This year is on pace to set a record for ice melt here in the Arctic. And the NASA scientists are finding out that it's not just hotter air, but also warmer ocean water that's causing a lot of the attrition that's making these glaciers lose so much ice. We're gearing up for our flight with the guys from NASA, the ONG project, Oceans Melting Greenland, where they're sort of mapping how quickly the oceans are melting, why they're melting.
We think of Greenland like a big ice cube with a hairdryer on it, right? So the air is warming up and it's melting from the top. But in fact, the ice here is very dynamic. It flows right off the land into the ocean, and a lot of the glaciers that carry that ice sit below sea level. So the ice literally feels the ocean warming as well. Greenland has impacts all around the planet. 1 billion tons of ice lost here raises sea levels in Australia, in Southeast Asia, in the United States, in Europe, all over the world, because we're all connected by the same ocean.
The new fires are sporadic, they pop up, they destroy vast amounts of land very quickly. There's winds blowing, intense dry heat everywhere. This is the land we flew over for 4, but the devastation is more final from the ground. It feels a bit like the end of the world, doesn't it? And when flames rage like this, the firefighters actually have to pull back. And there's nothing they can do, really, until the wind dies down.
This is not just a forest burning, this is almost a cemetery, because all you can see is dead.
It is just terrifying, really, how absolutely endless the line of fire is.
The rainforests in Indonesia are burning. Firefighters have been battling this blaze for weeks. And at its peak this summer, the government says there were thousands of similar fires all across Borneo and Sumatra. The Indonesian government has been fighting these forest fires on the ground and in the air. And we're about to get a look at how they water bomb the fires using these helicopters that carry baskets full of water. All right, bombs away. These animals face incredible threats. Their population has plummeted over the past 20 years. One of the primary threats is deforestation. Natural habitat like this being removed for human settlement, for agriculture.
The spring of 2019 will go down as one of the most brutal ever. They had these torrential rains, bomb cyclones, and because this is the kind of event that goes hand in hand with a warmer, wetter climate, this is why scientists are predicting that farming is just going to get harder and harder in coming generations.
So this corn is almost 2 feet shorter than it normally is. I'm looking at probably a 20 to 30% drop in yield just from the poor spring we had. In Iowa, we just set a record last year, the last 12 months, ending this spring, of a record amount of rainfall, which creates erosion, it creates water quality issues, it takes fertilizer, our precious topsoil with it, things that put nitrates in water, phosphorus in water.
The biggest problem now facing the world is climate change. And if we don't figure out how to do something about this, and pretty quickly, then we're going to hit a catastrophic tipping point.
This is all volunteer. They're going to get their neighbors. There are people who've lost their lives out there, we are told. They brought back at least one body, and they say they will not stop until they get everybody.
My poor little wife,
got hypothermia, and she was standing on top of the kitchen cabinets until they disintegrated. The water was coming up quick. It came all the way up to where it was up to our necks on there. I kept with her, and she just drowned on me.
I'm so sorry.
I know.
It's been 1 month since Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas, and the people here are still suffering. We just docked in Freeport, Bahamas, and we will be following a group of medical professionals. They're grabbing what they need, and then they'll be going out in the field to tend to the sick. What's your biggest concern?
As we continue to drive through, there's a distinct smell of bodies that are decomposing.
I haven't seen any search and rescue to come get any other bodies.
Some people don't understand or believe the climate crisis. They don't understand that it's real. We can already see the changes. We already have increased the temperature above pre-industrial levels 1.2 degrees. And everything is happening very fast now. We need to act as if we were in a crisis.
Now to a dire warning about climate change. According to a new report, experts say that we have until 2030 to avoid catastrophe. It also says if unprecedented changes are not made and made soon, there will be irreversible damage to the planet. The report focuses on what could happen if global temperatures rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. It would likely mean more erratic weather, dangerous heat waves, rising sea levels, and dying coral reefs. CNN meteorologist Ivan Cabrera is in the International Weather Center following this story. And Ivan, what more can you tell us about this very dire warning?
Yeah, so 2030, I mean, we're talking about 12 years at this point here, getting very close. And of course, all the while, I mean, we've already seen climate change take its toll on the planet. So yes, another climate report and more bad news. This one, of course, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I want to drill down the numbers here because they may not sound like a lot, but they are huge in what differences result as temperatures go from 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2. Huge difference. All right, so this is what we've already done, right? We've warmed the planet since 1900 with the Industrial Revolution by 1 degree. What has that brought us? Well, that's brought us record heat waves here. Look at this, 2015, 2016, and 2017, all those years, 3 of the hottest years on record. We know the heat waves have been ongoing. We've had, of course, more record floods. We have more significant droughts. We have all these events that are more frequent and more intense as a result of climate change. Each and every one can't be associated to that, but the frequency and their intensity certainly will be over the next several decades. So this is what the report is coming up with. This is what George was talking about. 2030, CO2 emissions, got to get them down by almost half. That is a tall order. That is going to be very difficult. And by 2050, we have to get them to 100%, basically carbon neutral. And so that is what the study is talking about here. So the way we do that is we source 70 to 85%, right, of electricity from renewables. We put a price on greenhouse emissions, and then we use technology to remove the CO2 that we've already pumped into the atmosphere out of there. With the Paris Accord, that's a step, but it's not enough. That'll get us to between 1.5 and 2, and we have to continue to bring that down. Otherwise, it's going to be exponential as far as the damage to the planet.